What if the part of yourself you've spent your entire life trying to destroy is actually the source of your greatest strength? Carl Jung believed that every human being carries a hidden side, a side filled with anger, envy, fear, ambition, selfishness, pride, forbidden desires, and painful memories. Society teaches you to hide these traits. Your family tells you to suppress them. Religion may tell you to fight them. Even your own mind convinces you they should never exist. So you spend years pretending to be someone you're not. You become kind when you're secretly furious. You become agreeable when you're desperate to say no. You smile while resentment quietly grows inside you. You convince yourself that if you can just eliminate everything dark within you, you'll finally become the person you're supposed to be. But according to Carl Jung, that's the greatest psychological mistake a person can make, because what you reject doesn't disappear. It waits, hidden beneath your personality, hidden beneath your identity, hidden beneath the version of yourself that the world applauds. And while you believe you're in control, that hidden part begins making your decisions. It influences your relationships. It shapes your fears. It chooses your partners. It sabotages your opportunities. It whispers every time you doubt yourself. The terrifying part is that most people never realize it's happening. They spend decades fighting an invisible enemy, only to discover that the enemy was never their darkness. It was their refusal to face it. Jung called this hidden force the shadow, not because it is evil, but because it exists outside the light of your awareness. Everything you refuse to acknowledge becomes part of your shadow. Every emotion you deny, every instinct you suppress, every truth you refuse to admit, every piece of yourself you abandon just to be accepted. And the larger your shadow becomes, the more power it gains over your life. This is why some of the nicest people suddenly explode in uncontrollable anger. Why seemingly successful people secretly hate themselves. Why people sabotage relationships they desperately wanted to keep. Why fear always appears right before greatness. Why confidence feels impossible for those who spend their lives hiding who they truly are. None of this happens by accident. It happens because the shadow always demands to be seen. The question isn't whether you have one. Every human being does. The real question is your shadow controlling you? Or are you learning how to work with it? Because here's the shocking truth Jung spent his life trying to explain. Your darkest traits may not be your greatest weakness. They may be the very qualities capable of transforming your life. The anger you've been afraid of could become courage. The ambition you've been ashamed of could become purpose. The sensitivity you've tried to hide could become wisdom. Even your deepest fears may contain the exact strength you've been searching for your entire life. Everything depends on whether you keep running or finally turn around and face what's been following you all along. In this video, you'll discover why your darkest traits are not your enemy, how Carl Jung believed the shadow secretly shapes your reality, and why embracing what you've always feared may become the most powerful decision you'll ever make. Because the life you've been chasing may be hidden inside the part of yourself you've spent years trying to escape. Most people imagine that meeting their shadow will feel dramatic. They expect some terrifying psychological breakdown, a life-changing crisis, a moment that shakes their entire identity. Sometimes it happens that way. But more often, the shadow introduces itself quietly. It appears in the people you cannot stand. Have you ever met someone who instantly irritated you for reasons you couldn't explain? Maybe they seemed arrogant, too confident, too emotional, too weak, too selfish, too successful, too free. Jung believed these intense emotional reactions often reveal something hidden inside ourselves, not because the other person is perfect, but because they reflect a part of us we've buried. This psychological process is called projection. Projection happens when your unconscious mind takes qualities you refuse to recognize within yourself and places them onto someone else. Instead of seeing your own hidden anger, you only notice angry people. Instead of admitting your own pride, you become obsessed with the arrogance of others. Instead of accepting your own desire for freedom, you judge anyone who refuses to follow society's rules. The shadow is incredibly intelligent. It protects itself by convincing you that it belongs to everyone else. That is why self-awareness is so rare. Most people spend their entire lives analyzing other people without ever realizing they are secretly describing themselves. Jung warned that everything unconscious seeks expression. If you refuse to recognize it internally, life will force you to experience it externally. The people who trigger you, the conflicts that repeat, the same painful relationship patterns, the same disappointments, the same emotional wounds. These are rarely random. They are often invitations from the unconscious, not punishments, but messages. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack your entire life without knowing it's there. After years, the weight feels normal. You stop questioning why you're exhausted. You simply believe life is supposed to feel that way. The shadow works in a similar manner. It silently grows heavier every year you ignore it. Each suppressed emotion, each denied desire, each hidden fear adds another invisible stone. Eventually, the weight becomes impossible to ignore. Anxiety appears. Depression grows. Relationships collapse. Motivation disappears. You begin asking questions that have no obvious answers. Why do I always attract the same people? Why do I sabotage my own success? Why do I feel empty even when everything looks fine? Jung believed these questions mark the beginning of true psychological transformation, not because life is falling apart, but because the false self you've built can no longer carry the weight of everything you've hidden. The shadow isn't trying to destroy you, it's trying to make itself known. Every uncomfortable emotion becomes a doorway. Every irrational fear points somewhere deeper. Every emotional trigger reveals a hidden truth waiting beneath the surface. Most people slam that door shut. They distract themselves. They blame others. They stay busy. They numb themselves with entertainment, work, social media, or constant noise. Anything to avoid being alone with their own mind. But silence is dangerous, because that's where the shadow begins to speak. And once you hear it, you can never pretend it doesn't exist again. The journey Carl Jung described doesn't begin by becoming a better person. It begins by becoming an honest one. Because only when you stop running from yourself can you finally discover who you've always been. If the shadow is everything you've hidden, then who is the person you've been pretending to be? Carl Jung called this mask the persona. The persona is the version of yourself designed for survival. It isn't completely fake. But it isn't completely real either. It's the face you learned to wear so the world would accept you. Think about childhood. Long before you understood who you truly were, you learned which parts of yourself were rewarded and which parts were rejected. Maybe you were praised for being quiet, so you buried your anger. Maybe you were loved only when you achieved something, so you learned your worth depended on success. Maybe you were told not to cry, not to complain, not to be emotional, not to be different. Little by little, you started editing yourself. not because you wanted to, because you believed you had to. Each rejection became a lesson. Each criticism became another layer of the mask. Eventually, you forgot where the mask ended and where the real you began. This is one of Jung's most unsettling discoveries. The persona can become so convincing that even you believe it. You wake up every morning playing a role. The responsible one, the strong one, the perfect parent, the successful professional, the spiritual person, the nice guy, the woman who never needs help. Everyone sees the character. Almost no one sees the human being beneath it. And the more perfect the mask becomes, the darker the shadow grows. Because every quality that doesn't fit the image gets pushed underground. The person who always smiles may carry unbearable rage. The person who always helps everyone may secretly crave freedom. The person who appears fearless may be terrified of rejection. The more energy you spend protecting the persona, the less energy you have left to actually live. This explains why so many successful people suddenly experience emotional collapse. From the outside, their lives look perfect. Inside, they're exhausted, not because success failed them, but because maintaining a false identity requires enormous psychological energy. The unconscious eventually demands payment. That's when life begins removing the mask for you. A betrayal, a divorce, losing your job, a panic attack, a midlife crisis, a deep depression. These experiences often feel like cruel punishment, but Jung saw them differently. He believed life wasn't destroying your identity, it was destroying the illusion, because the false self can never sustain itself forever. Eventually, reality demands authenticity. This is why many people resist transformation, not because change is impossible, but because the mask feels safer than the truth. The persona promises acceptance, the shadow demands honesty. One offers comfort, the other offers freedom, and those two things rarely arrive together. The tragedy is that most people spend decades trying to perfect a mask instead of discovering the person hiding behind it. They chase approval, status, validation, recognition, all while the authentic self quietly waits beneath the surface, patiently, silently, knowing that one day the mask will crack. And when it does, you will face the most important question of your life. If everything you've been pretending to be disappears, who are you really? There is a painful irony at the heart of human nature. The very qualities that could set you free are often the same qualities you were taught to fear. Imagine a child who is naturally bold, curious, unafraid to question authority, full of intensity. If that child grows up in an environment where obedience is rewarded and individuality is punished, what happens? The boldness doesn't disappear. It becomes buried. The curiosity becomes silence. The intensity becomes anxiety. The confidence becomes self-doubt. The gift survives, but it changes its shape. This is one of Jung's most profound insights. The shadow does not only contain your darkest impulses, it also contains your greatest potential. Many people assume the shadow is filled only with rage, jealousy, selfishness, or fear. But that is only half the story. The shadow also holds your creativity, your courage, your independence, your ambition, your authenticity, the version of yourself that refused to conform, the version that once dreamed without limits, the version that existed before fear taught you who you were allowed to become. Think about the moments when you've admired someone so deeply that almost hurt. Someone fearless, someone confident, someone who speaks their truth without apology, someone who walks away from what no longer serves them. Why do those people affect you so strongly? Jung believed admiration often reveals hidden possibilities within ourselves. Just as projection can reveal what we reject, admiration can reveal what we've abandoned. The qualities you long for in others may already exist inside you. They simply remain trapped beneath years of conditioning. This is why transformation feels less like learning something new and more like remembering something ancient. The shadow does not ask you to become someone different. It asks you to recover the parts of yourself you left behind. Perhaps you abandoned your voice. Perhaps you abandoned your sensitivity because someone called it weakness. Perhaps you abandoned your ambition because you feared being judged. Perhaps you abandoned your confidence because someone convinced you it was arrogance. Little by little, you became smaller, safer, more acceptable, and with every compromise, you drifted further away from yourself. The tragedy is that the world often rewards this disconnection. People praise those who never create conflict, who never say no, who always sacrifice themselves for everyone else, who smile even when they're breaking inside. But the unconscious cannot be deceived forever. Eventually, it demands balance. The parts you've rejected begin pushing back. Not to punish you, but to restore you. This is why your greatest transformation may begin with the very qualities you've spent years trying to suppress. The anger that teaches you to establish boundaries. The ambition that inspires you to build a meaningful life. The confidence that allows you to stop living for other people's approval. The sensitivity that helps you understand pain instead of running from it. These qualities were never your enemy, only their unconscious expression was. Integrated consciously, they become extraordinary strengths. Ignored, they become invisible prisons. This is why shadow work is not about becoming a better version of yourself. It is about becoming a more complete one. Because the strongest people are not those who have eliminated their darkness. They are the ones who have learned to transform it into wisdom. And once you begin seeing your shadow through that lens, everything changes. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What part of me has been waiting all these years to finally come home?" That single question has the power to change an entire life. If your shadow contains not only your deepest fears, but also your greatest strengths, why doesn't your mind simply reveal it? Why does it hide the very qualities capable of transforming your life? According to Carl Jung, the answer is surprisingly simple. Because the unconscious is not designed to make you comfortable. It is designed to keep you psychologically alive. Long before you learned to think logically, your mind learned how to survive. It watched. It listened. It remembered. Every painful experience became a lesson. Every rejection became a warning. Every humiliation became evidence that certain parts of you were dangerous to express. Perhaps you spoke your mind once and were mocked. Perhaps you trusted someone and were betrayed. Perhaps you showed vulnerability and were told you were weak. The unconscious never forgot those moments. It created an invisible rule. Never let that happen again. From that moment forward, it began protecting you. Not from physical danger, but from emotional pain. And the easiest way to avoid pain was to hide the parts of yourself that seemed to cause it. This is why the shadow becomes locked away. Not because your unconscious hates you, but because it believes it is protecting you. Imagine an ancient castle under attack. When danger approaches, the gates close. The treasures are hidden, everything valuable is locked deep inside the walls. Years pass. The war ends. But no one ever opens the gates again. The protection that once saved the kingdom eventually becomes its prison. Your mind works in much the same way. Many of your defenses were once necessary. As a child, they may have protected you. Silence kept you safe. People-pleasing avoided conflict. Perfection earned approval. Emotional numbness reduced pain. These strategies were intelligent, even beautiful, because they allowed you to survive experiences that may have overwhelmed you otherwise. But survival is not the same as living. The tragedy begins when yesterday's protection becomes today's identity. You no longer say, "I learned to stay silent." You begin saying, "I'm just a quiet person." You no longer think, "I became a perfectionist because I feared rejection." You say, "That's just who I am." Slowly, the defense becomes your personality. The prison becomes your home. And because it feels familiar, you stop questioning it. Jung believed this is one of the greatest illusions of the human psyche. We confuse adaptation with authenticity. We mistake coping mechanisms for character. We defend behaviors that were never truly ours. The unconscious does this because certainty feels safer than change. Even suffering can feel safer than the unknown. This explains why people often return to toxic relationships, remain in unfulfilling careers, repeat destructive habits, or sabotage opportunities they desperately wanted, not because they enjoy suffering, but because the familiar feels less frightening than transformation. The unconscious whispers, "Stay where you know you'll survive," even if survival means sacrificing your potential. This is why genuine growth feels so uncomfortable. You are not simply changing your behavior. You are challenging the very system that has spent years trying to protect you. And that system will resist. It will create doubt, fear, excuses. It will convince you that now is not the right time, that you're not ready, that you're asking too much of yourself. But what if those thoughts are not the truth? What if they are simply the voice of an old survival strategy, trying to keep the gates closed? Jung believed that every step toward consciousness requires an act of courage, not the courage to fight the shadow, but the courage to question the stories you've believed about yourself for years. Because sometimes the strongest prison is not built from stone. It is built from beliefs. Beliefs that once protected you, but no longer allow you to become the person you were always capable of being. And the moment you begin questioning those beliefs, the gates begin to open. Not all at once, not without fear, but enough for the light to finally reach the parts of yourself that have waited in darkness for far too long. There is a moment that almost no one talks about, a moment that arrives quietly, long before your life visibly changes. It begins the instant you stop believing every thought your mind produces. For years, your inner voice may have sounded like the truth. You're not good enough. Don't take the risk. People won't accept the real you. Stay where it's safe. You never questioned those thoughts. Why would you? They had been with you for as long as you could remember. They felt like your own voice. But what if they never were? Jung believed that much of what we call our personality is simply unconscious conditioning. Ideas repeated so many times that they become invisible, like the air you breathe. You no longer notice them, you simply live inside them. The first sign of awakening is not confidence. It is awareness. You begin catching yourself in the middle of old patterns. You notice the fear before it controls your decision. You recognize the need for approval before it changes your behavior. You pause, instead of reacting automatically. That pause may seem insignificant, but psychologically, it changes everything, because for the first time, there is space between you and the unconscious program that has been running your life. Freedom begins in that space, not complete freedom, Not permanent freedom, but enough to choose differently. Perhaps you finally speak when you would normally remain silent. Perhaps you walk away from a relationship that survives only because you keep abandoning yourself. Perhaps you stop apologizing for existing. Perhaps you allow yourself to disappoint someone without believing you have become a bad person. These moments appear ordinary, but they are revolutionary. Because every conscious decision weakens an unconscious pattern. Little by little, the person you've always pretended to be begins losing its authority, not through force, but through understanding. This is why real transformation is often invisible at first. The outside world may not notice anything. Your family may think you're exactly the same. Your friends may see no difference. But inside, an entirely different life is beginning. Your priorities shift. Conversations that once interested you begin feeling empty. Validation loses its addictive power. Silence becomes less frightening. Solitude becomes a place of discovery instead of loneliness. You stop chasing constant certainty. You become curious about your own reactions, curious about your dreams, curious about the parts of yourself you've spent years avoiding. This curiosity is one of the greatest signs that the shadow is no longer your enemy. It is becoming your teacher. Jung believed that the unconscious is endlessly creative. Once you stop fearing it, it begins revealing gifts you never knew you possessed. Ideas appear unexpectedly. Your intuition grows stronger. Your creativity returns. Your decisions become clearer. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because less energy is being wasted maintaining a false identity. Imagine carrying a heavy suit of armor every single day. Eventually, you forget how heavy it is. You assume exhaustion is simply part of being alive. Then, one day, you take it off. The world hasn't become lighter. You have. That is what integration feels like. You begin recovering energy that was never truly lost. It was simply trapped inside the effort of pretending. This is why your darkest traits can become your greatest strength, not because darkness itself is powerful, but because hidden energy becomes available the moment it is brought into the light. The courage you buried, the confidence you suppressed, the ambition you apologized for, the sensitivity you called weakness. None of it disappeared. It was waiting. Patiently, silently, for the day you stopped asking, "How do I become someone else?" and started asking, "Who have I been all along?" That question marks the true beginning of individuation, not becoming a new person, but finally giving yourself permission to become the person you were never allowed to be. One of the greatest surprises on the journey of transformation is discovering that not everyone wants to see you become whole. We like to believe that growth will always be celebrated, that the moment we become more authentic, the people around us will cheer us on. But life rarely works that way. In fact, the more you become yourself, the more uncomfortable you may make others. At first, this feels confusing. You've become more honest, more self-aware, more peaceful. So why does it suddenly feel like certain relationships are becoming more difficult? Carl Jung believed that every relationship is in part a relationship between two unconscious minds. Most people don't simply relate to who you are. They relate to the version of you that fits their own psychological world. The agreeable version, the predictable version, the version that never challenged their expectations, the version that always said yes, the version that stayed small enough to make everyone else feel comfortable. As long as you remain that person, the relationship feels stable. But the moment you begin changing, the unconscious balance begins to shift. Suddenly, the people who once praised your kindness accuse you of becoming selfish. The people who admired your generosity question why you've become distant. The people who relied on your silence become uncomfortable when you finally speak the truth. Did you really become selfish? Or did you simply stop abandoning yourself? This is one of the shadow's greatest paradoxes. The healthier you become, the more clearly unhealthy dynamics reveal themselves, not because you're creating conflict, but because you're no longer participating in unconscious patterns that kept everyone comfortable. Imagine a stage play. For years, every actor has memorized their role. Everyone knows exactly what to say, exactly how to respond, exactly who they're supposed to be. Then, one day, one actor decides to stop reading the script. Immediately, the entire play begins to fall apart. Not because that person ruined the performance, but because everyone else was depending on them to keep acting. Life works the same way. Families develop unconscious roles. Friendships develop unconscious expectations. Relationships create invisible agreements. One person becomes the rescuer, another becomes the victim, another becomes the caretaker, another becomes the one who never expresses anger. These roles can last for decades, until someone wakes up. When you begin integrating your shadow, you stop playing the role. You begin responding instead of reacting. You stop seeking constant approval. You stop apologizing for your boundaries. You stop confusing love with self-sacrifice. To someone who benefited from your unconscious behavior, this transformation may feel threatening, not because you've become difficult, but because you've become free. Freedom has a strange effect. It exposes invisible chains. And people who are still imprisoned by their own unconscious patterns often struggle to understand those who begin breaking them. This is why Jung believed that individuation can feel profoundly lonely, not because you're separating yourself from humanity, but because you're separating yourself from illusion. Some relationships deepen, others quietly fade away. Some people become curious about your growth, others become defensive. Some will ask what changed, others will insist you've changed for the worse. Do not mistake resistance for failure. Very often, resistance is evidence that something real is happening. The false self needed constant approval to survive. The authentic self does not. It seeks truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. It chooses integrity over acceptance, awareness over performance, wholeness over perfection. And perhaps that is the greatest test on this journey. Not whether you can discover your hidden strength, but whether you can continue living from it, even when the world around you preferred the person you used to be. Because your greatest strength was never meant to make everyone comfortable. It was meant to make you whole. There is a strange moment that arrives after you've spent enough time confronting your shadow. It is not dramatic. There is no sudden enlightenment, no voice from the sky, no single event that changes everything overnight. Instead, you begin noticing something subtle. Life no longer feels like a performance. For years, you may have measured every word before speaking. You carefully observed people's reactions. You adjusted your personality depending on who stood in front of you. You tried to become whoever you believed they wanted you to be. Without realizing it, you slowly disappeared. This is what happens when the persona controls your life. You become an expert at adaptation, but a stranger to yourself. Carl Jung believed that the greatest psychological tragedy is not suffering. It is living an entire lifetime without ever becoming the person you truly are. Many people die having fulfilled everyone else's expectations while abandoning their own soul. because authenticity has a price. It asks you to disappoint people. It asks you to leave environments that no longer reflect who you are. It asks you to let go of identities that once made you feel safe. That is terrifying. Because certainty, even painful certainty, often feels more comfortable than freedom. The mind always prefers the familiar, even when the familiar is slowly destroying you. But something remarkable happens when you continue choosing awareness over comfort. The fear doesn't completely disappear. It simply loses its authority. You stop asking yourself, "Will people approve of me?" and begin asking, "Can I respect myself if I betray who I am?" That question changes everything, because for the first time your decisions begin coming from your deepest values, instead of your deepest fears. You stop chasing relationships that require you to shrink. You stop apologizing for having boundaries. You stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to understand you. Not because you've become called, but because you finally become honest. There is immense freedom in honesty, not the honesty that judges others, the honesty that refuses to lie to yourself. You no longer pretend to enjoy what empties you. You no longer force yourself to remain where your spirit quietly dies. You no longer sacrifice your authenticity simply to avoid rejection. This is where your darkest traits begin revealing their true purpose. The anger you once feared becomes the courage to protect your peace. The ambition you once suppressed becomes the discipline to build a meaningful life. The sensitivity you once called weakness becomes your ability to understand yourself and others more deeply. Even your loneliness changes. It is no longer the loneliness of feeling abandoned. It becomes the solitude where your real self finally has room to breathe. Jung understood something that modern culture often forgets. Wholeness is infinitely more valuable than perfection. Perfection demands constant performance. Wholeness simply asks for truth. And truth is surprisingly peaceful, not because it removes suffering, but because it removes the exhausting need to constantly pretend. Imagine carrying a mask every single day for decades. Eventually, you forget you're wearing it. Then, one day, you take it off. The world looks the same, the people around you look the same, but your breathing feels different. Lighter, deeper, freer, that is what happens when your hidden strength finally emerges. You realize that the qualities you spent years rejecting were never obstacles. They were unfinished parts of your humanity, waiting patiently to be accepted, to be understood, to become part of something greater, not your shadow, but your wholeness. Because your greatest strength was never found in becoming someone else, it was found in having the courage to stop running from yourself. And perhaps that is the greatest freedom any human being can ever experience. There is a common misunderstanding about shadow work. Many people believe it is about discovering something hidden, finding the missing piece, unlocking a secret buried deep within the unconscious. But Carl Jung believed the real challenge begins after the discovery. Seeing your shadow is difficult. Living with it consciously is far more difficult. Because awareness changes nothing, unless it changes the way you live. You can recognize every unconscious pattern you've ever developed. You can understand exactly why you became the person you are. You can explain your childhood, your fears, your trauma, your emotional triggers, and still continue making the same decisions tomorrow. Insight alone does not create transformation. Only conscious action does. This is why Jung insisted that individuation is not an event, it is a practice. a lifelong conversation between the conscious mind and the unconscious. Every single day presents an opportunity, not to become perfect, but to become more aware. Imagine waking up tomorrow. Nothing around you has changed. The same job, the same relationships, the same responsibilities, the same challenges, but something inside you has. For the first time, you notice your automatic reactions before they take control. Someone criticizes you. Instead of immediately becoming defensive, you pause. You ask yourself, why did those words affect me so deeply? Someone disappoints you. Instead of pretending everything is fine, you acknowledge your anger without letting it control you. Fear appears before an important decision. Instead of running from it, you become curious. What exactly is this fear trying to protect? That single question changes everything. Because fear is rarely trying to stop your future. More often, it is trying to protect your past. The unconscious still believes yesterday's dangers exist today. It continues using old survival strategies long after they are no longer necessary. The moment you recognize this, compassion begins replacing self-judgment. You stop calling yourself weak. You stop calling yourself broken. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? Instead, you begin asking, what happened to me, and what part of me is still trying to survive? That shift is extraordinary. Because healing never begins with condemnation. It begins with understanding. This is why your shadow cannot be integrated through force. You cannot hate yourself into becoming whole. You cannot shame yourself into transformation. You cannot reject wounded parts of yourself and expect them to trust you. Imagine trying to comfort a frightened child by yelling at them. It would never work. Yet this is exactly how many people treat themselves. Every mistake becomes evidence of failure. Every emotion becomes something to suppress. Every weakness becomes another reason to feel ashamed. The shadow listens, and every act of self-rejection pushes it further back into darkness. Integration asks for something radically different. Patience, honesty, compassion, the willingness to remain present with uncomfortable emotions instead of escaping them. Not because suffering is meaningful by itself, but because every emotion carries information. Every reaction points somewhere. Every trigger reveals a hidden belief. Every uncomfortable feeling becomes an invitation to know yourself more deeply. Little by little, the relationship between you and your shadow begins changing. It no longer feels like an enemy hiding in the darkness. It becomes a guide, a teacher, a mirror, one that reveals not only your wounds but your potential. This is why your darkest traits can become your greatest strength, not because darkness itself has power, but because everything you've hidden contains energy. And the moment that energy is reclaimed consciously, it stops working against you. It begins working for you. The confidence you buried becomes leadership. The anger you feared becomes healthy boundaries. The sensitivity you rejected becomes profound empathy. The ambition you suppress becomes meaningful purpose. The courage you abandoned returns, not as something new, but as something remembered. Perhaps the greatest lesson Jung ever offered is this: your shadow has never been asking you to become someone different. It has only been asking you to become completely yourself. And once that journey begins, there is no greater strength a human being can possess. There is one thought that has haunted human beings for centuries. Not the fear of failure, not the fear of rejection, not even the fear of death. It is something far quieter, far more personal. The fear that one day you will realize you never truly lived as yourself. Imagine reaching the end of your life and looking back, not at the mistakes you made, but at the person you never allowed yourself to become, the conversations you never had, the dreams you abandoned, the boundaries you never set, the truth you were too afraid to speak, the life you silently sacrificed just to remain accepted. Carl Jung believed this was one of the deepest tragedies of the human experience. Not that people suffer, but that they remain strangers to themselves, because every day you ignore your shadow, you also ignore a part of your potential. Every day you silence your authentic voice, you strengthen the life that fear designed for you. And fear has a remarkable ability. It makes survival feel like success. You convince yourself that because nothing terrible happened, everything must be fine. But surviving is not the same as living. A prison can become comfortable. A mask can become familiar. A false identity can become so convincing that you forget there was ever another way to exist. This is why transformation often begins with discomfort, not because suffering is noble, but because comfort can become the greatest obstacle to authenticity. There comes a moment when the soul quietly asks, how much longer are you going to pretend? Not pretend for other people. Pretend for yourself. How much longer will you keep saying yes when your entire being wants to say no? How much longer will you keep chasing approval while abandoning your own truth? How much longer will you continue living according to fears that no longer belong to the person you are becoming? These questions cannot be answered intellectually. They must be lived. One decision at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one courageous step at a time. This is why individuation is never dramatic. It is built through ordinary moments. The moment you stop apologizing for your boundaries, the moment you choose authenticity over popularity, the moment you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, the moment you trust your own inner voice more than the expectations surrounding you. These moments appear small, but they reshape an entire life. Slowly, almost invisibly, you begin noticing something extraordinary. The constant noise inside your mind becomes quieter. The need to compare yourself with everyone else begins to fade. The endless search for external validation loses its grip. You begin feeling something that many people spend their entire lives searching for: inner peace. Not because every problem disappears, but because the war inside you finally begins to end. You stop fighting your own humanity. You stop trying to become perfect. You stop believing that love must be earned through performance. Instead, you begin living from a place that is both stronger and gentler. You become less interested in proving your worth because you no longer doubt that it exists. That is the hidden gift of the shadow. It does not simply reveal your darkness, it reveals the life that has been waiting beneath your fear. A life that does not depend on perfection. A life that does not require constant approval. A life built upon truth instead of performance. And perhaps that is why your darkest traits can become your greatest strength. Because once they are understood, accepted, and integrated, they no longer imprison your future. They become the foundation upon which your most authentic life is built. The person you've been searching for has never been waiting somewhere in the future. They have been waiting, patiently, silently, beneath every mask you were taught to wear. And the moment you finally have the courage to remove those masks, you don't become someone new. You finally meet the person you were always meant to be. Perhaps you've spent your entire life asking the wrong question. How do I get rid of my darkness? Carl Jung would have asked a very different one. What if your darkness has been trying to save you all along? That idea feels uncomfortable. We've been taught to divide ourselves into good and bad, light and dark, strength and weakness, acceptable and unacceptable. But life doesn't work that way, neither does the human mind. Every quality you've rejected, every emotion you've hidden, every part of yourself you've tried to silence has continued existing, not because it wanted to punish you, but because it wanted to become whole again. The shadow has never asked for perfection. It has only asked not to be abandoned. Think about the strongest people you've ever met, not the loudest, not the most successful, not the most admired, the strongest. They rarely pretend to have no darkness. They don't spend their lives trying to convince the world they're flawless. Instead, they know themselves. They know what they're capable of. They understand their anger without being consumed by it. They understand their fear without obeying it. They understand their ambition without becoming its prisoner. That is real strength. Not the absence of darkness, but the ability to walk through it consciously. Jung believed that becoming whole was the true purpose of psychological growth. Not becoming perfect, not becoming morally superior, not becoming someone who never struggles, but becoming someone who no longer needs to hide from themselves. Imagine how much energy you've spent throughout your life pretending to be stronger than you felt, pretending not to care, pretending not to be afraid, pretending to be happy, pretending to be someone the world could easily accept. Now imagine recovering all of that energy. Imagine what your life could become if none of it had to be wasted maintaining a mask. That is what shadow work offers, not magical answers, not instant healing. Freedom, the freedom that comes when you no longer divide yourself into pieces, when you stop declaring war on your own humanity, when you stop believing that your worth depends on hiding the parts of yourself that once frightened you. Because the truth is, your greatest strength has never been your confidence, or your intelligence, or your achievements. Your greatest strength is your willingness to face yourself honestly, to look directly into the places you've spent years avoiding and remain there, without running, without pretending, without turning away. Very few people ever develop that courage. Most spend their entire lives searching for themselves in careers, relationships, money, recognition, only to discover that the person they were looking for was never outside them. The journey was always inward. Perhaps that is why you found this video. Perhaps something inside you has grown tired of pretending, tired of surviving, tired of carrying identities that no longer fit. If that's true, then don't fear what you're beginning to discover. Because what feels like the end of your old identity may actually be the beginning of your real life. Your shadow is not standing between you and your future. It is standing beside the doorway, waiting for the moment you finally choose to walk through it. And when you do, you won't become someone new. You'll become someone infinitely more powerful. You'll become someone real, someone whole, someone who no longer needs permission to exist exactly as they are. That is the hidden gift Carl Jung spent his life trying to reveal. Your darkest traits were never your greatest weakness. They were the forgotten pieces of your greatest strength. And perhaps the life you've always wanted has been waiting inside them all along. If you've stayed with me until this moment, perhaps something inside you already knew these words weren't just information. They were recognition. Because deep down, every human being carries a part of themselves they've been afraid to meet. Some spend their entire lives running from it. Others find the courage to turn around. And that single decision changes everything. Carl Jung once said that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. But that journey doesn't begin by finding more light. It begins by having the courage to stop fearing your own darkness. Maybe your greatest strength has never been waiting somewhere in your future. Maybe it has been quietly waiting inside the parts of yourself you've spent years trying to hide. And perhaps today is the day you stop running. If this video helped you see yourself from a different perspective, I'd like to ask you something. Subscribe to The Inner Shadow. Not because it's just another YouTube channel, but because every week we take another step into the hidden depths of the human mind through Carl Jung, shadow work, emotional healing, and psychological transformation. If this is the kind of journey you've been searching for, I would be honored to have you walk it with us. And if this reflection resonated with you, take a moment to leave a like. That simple action tells YouTube to recommend these conversations to people who may be silently struggling with the very same questions. Finally, think of one person, someone who feels lost, someone trapped in old patterns, someone who has spent years believing there's something wrong with them. Share this video with them. You never know when a single conversation becomes the beginning of someone's transformation. Thank you for being here. Until our next journey, remember this: the shadow was never the part of you that needed to disappear. It was the part of you waiting to become whole. And when you finally stop fighting your darkness, you don't lose yourself, you find yourself.